I'm Jay Foster, Director of Body Chemistry Associates, and we're presenting these lectures on various different topics about once a month here at the Planetarium. Next month, we're going to talk about blood sugar disorders, hypoglycemia, and type 2 diabetes. We'll talk about that next month. Tonight, we're going to talk all about reversing heart disease and high cholesterol the natural way. And I wanted to start, since we're at the Planetarium, I wanted to start out because we're going to talk a lot about magnesium. This is a new composite image from the Chandra X-ray Observatory. It shows two colliding galaxies more than 100 million years after they first impacted each other, continuing about 62 million light years from Earth. Image shows huge clouds of interstellar gas that have been injected with rich deposits of elements from supernova explosions. Enriched gas includes elements such as oxygen, iron, magnesium, and silicon. We're going to talk a lot about magnesium tonight, so that's why I picked that slide, and I keep hitting the wrong button. So we're going to talk about reversing high cholesterol, heart disease, and bone loss the natural way. This is our battle cry, primum non nocere, which means first, do no harm. So whenever possible, we try natural, non-invasive techniques first and fall back on more harmful treatments, traditional treatments that with side effects second or last, including medications, because of the risk for side effects from those medications. Now, we're talking about side effects. We're not talking about headaches or abdominal discomfort or fatigue. We're talking about death as a side effect, as it was for over 100,000 people last year. It's actually closer to 250,000 people lost their lives last year from properly prescribed prescription medications. This is where the doctors did everything exactly as they were supposed to. They prescribed the medications to the exact extent and the exact amount they were supposed to. The side effect was the patient stopped breathing, and that's an unwanted side effect, but death as a side effect for 250,000 people is quite a lot. That's the equivalent of one fully packed 747 crashing every single day. If you can imagine waking up and seeing on the Miami Herald or the Sun Sentinel every single day, another 747 has crashed, another 747 has crashed, another 747 has crashed every single morning. Pretty soon they would stop 747s from flying until they figured out what was causing the problem. But unfortunately, until recently, the drug lobby has really enjoyed not being called on the rug for this kind of thing. And even, it's not just all prescription drugs, even over-the-counter drugs can kill. For instance, whereas in 1998, over 16,700 Americans died of AIDS, almost as many, 16,500, died from NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. That's like Motrin, ibuprofen. Killed almost as many people as AIDS did that year, but then year in, year out, 16,500 Americans die from non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Those come from gastrointestinal bleeding. Many of you know that these NSAID drugs people take for arthritis pain have a side effect of causing bleeding in the gut, and those people bled to death, bled out overnight basically, 16,500 people per year. As bad as that is, an equal number die from congestive heart failure. So we get 16,500 people dying every year from NSAIDs, from gastrointestinal bleeding. Another 16,500 die every year from congestive heart failure. That brings a grand total to 33,000 people that die every year just from non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which is pretty amazing when there are natural formulas to use for joint pains. So we're going to start out talking about natural ways to control cholesterol and triglycerides. I'm going to start out with a case history after I show you where we like these numbers to be. We like these blood chemistry optimals to be something like this. Triglycerides, which are the fatty sugars in the blood, they come from sugars and carbohydrates. We like those less than 100. Most labs say less than 150 or sometimes even 200. We like the triglycerides less than 100. If your triglycerides are high, because they come from sugars and carbohydrates, either you're eating too many carbohydrates and sugars or your body's not handling the amount that you're eating. Either way, you need to reduce carbohydrate intake if your triglycerides are high. Now, cholesterol, we have an optimal range. We like cholesterol to be 175 to 195, not too low and not too high. We all know that heart disease can come from high levels of cholesterol. Low levels of cholesterol actually affect your hormones. Every single steroid hormone in your body, estrogens, testosterone, vitamin D, corticosteroid stress hormones, progesterone, all come from cholesterol. So if your liver's not making enough cholesterol, you won't be able to make enough of those hormones, and you can have hormone irregularities. We've had women who couldn't conceive with a cholesterol of, let's say, 130, 140 or so, and many of the fertility clinics overlooked it completely because they think that a zero cholesterol almost is better than a high cholesterol, but we want the cholesterol to be in an optimal range. We like it 175 to 195. HDL, the happy cholesterol, the high density lipoprotein, the good cholesterol, we want that greater than 50, as high as possible. The LDL, the lousy cholesterol, the low density lipoprotein, the bad cholesterol, we want that less than 100, as low as possible without having to take a statin drug. And then one of the most important numbers on this page is the cholesterol to HDL ratio. You get that from dividing the total cholesterol by the HDL, and you get a number. And the number should be for men less than 5, or they call it less than 4.98, and for women, for females, less than 4.45. Again, that number should be as low as possible. So let me show you a case history we had. A 54-year-old man came into us with huge numbers on these triglycerides and cholesterol. Triglycerides should be less than 100. His were 3,395. That's fasting, no food, drink, or smoke for 12 hours. 3,395. When you spin that down in a centrifuge and look at it, it looks like a milkshake going through the bloodstream. It's really solid fat. The cholesterol should be under 200, 625. That was the highest cholesterol and triglycerides I had ever seen at the time. 625 cholesterol. His HDL was too low at 33. His bad cholesterol, LDL, they couldn't even perform the test because there was so much fat in the blood they couldn't calculate the bad cholesterol. Then the cholesterol HDL ratio, which should be less than 5, was an 18.94, way high. That's a walking heart attack. And even in the blood sugar within the diabetic range should be less than 100. His blood glucose level was 367, so he was classified as a diabetic. So he came into us with these kind of numbers, and he went away for 2 weeks at that time until we had all the test results back. And in that time, he had an appointment with his doctor, and his doctor said, well, I'm going to need a blood test. So he called our office up and said, can we use the same blood test you just got back rather than having the doctor having to stick me again? We said, sure. So we gave him a copy of this blood test. He went into his doctor's office. His doctor saw it, almost fell off his chair. He couldn't believe how high it was. He said, look, we have to do another test to make sure it's that high. They did another test in the office and found out that the triglycerides were indeed over 3,000 and the cholesterol way over 600. So the doctor started writing his prescription pad as fast as he could. And he said, first of all, I want you, for those triglycerides, I want you to go on a low-fat diet. Secondly, for the high cholesterol, I want you to go on a low-cholesterol diet. Thirdly, because of the high triglycerides and cholesterol, I'm going to write you a prescription for Lipitor, which is a statin drug, atorvastatin, to lower the triglycerides and cholesterol. And then because you're a diabetic, I'm going to have you take both glucophage and glucotrol, 2 separate medications for type 2 diabetes. And then finally, there was 3 or 4 other medications. So all of a sudden, the guy had a fistful of prescriptions, and he said, hey, doc, I just paid for this body chem program, Body Chemistry Associates. I'd like to try their thing first for a month. I'll come back. If it doesn't work, I'll come back and go on these medications. The doctor basically says, you're a dead guy if you walk out of here without these prescriptions. He said, okay, doc, I'll see you in a month. So he came to us, and for the same lab results, our recommendations were slightly different than what the doctor said. So our recommendations for the same lab results were the following. For his high triglycerides, since we know they come from sugars and carbs and not fat, where the doctor told him to go on a low-fat diet, we told him to go on a high-fat, high-protein diet. For his cholesterol was 625, the doctor told him to go on a low-cholesterol diet. We told him to go on a high-cholesterol diet. I told him he could eat 30 eggs a day if he wanted to. Now, this guy loved eggs, and he was just waiting for someone, an authority figure, to tell him it was okay to eat eggs. He started eating about 9 eggs a day. He'd have like 3 eggs at breakfast. He'd have hard-boiled eggs for snacks. He'd have egg salad at night. He went nuts. He was eating about 9 eggs a day. But we told him to go on a no sugar, and a very low-carb diet. He also had some weight to lose. So we put him on a modification of like an Atkins diet. And then we gave him some nutrients. We gave him our Niacol formula, our Colex formula to control cholesterol, and a bunch of other vitamins and minerals determined by his individual lab results. So we put him on the program. He went away, went on the diet we recommended and the nutrients for 1 month's time, came back a month later, and here were his second visit numbers without any medications at all. When he first came in, his triglycerides were 3,395. After 28 days on our diet, lots of vitamins, but no medications, his triglycerides came down to 149. The cholesterol was 625. He started eating 9 eggs a day. His cholesterol came down to 170. His HDL came up to normal. His LDL came down to normal. His ratio went from an 18.94 down to a 4.25, and his glucose came down almost to the normal range. And after another month, it was in the normal range. So, in fact, a year later, he was still in really good shape, had lost a lot of weight, and was doing very good with these. The cholesterol didn't come down because he was losing weight. All these came down because we corrected his fat metabolism on the inside, his sugar metabolism, and he was allowed to lose weight that way. We'll talk more about that on next month's topic. So if he can eat 9 eggs a day and not take any statin drugs and his cholesterol plummets, that must mean that eggs and butter and other high cholesterol foods have virtually nothing to do with your blood cholesterol, and that's true. You can eat 100 eggs a day if you want to. That will not raise your cholesterol. So if eggs and butter and other high cholesterol foods don't raise cholesterol, don't cause high cholesterol, what foods do? Well, to find out, we look at the laboratories that make the statin drugs because they had to study what caused high cholesterol when they were studying and trying to research these drugs. Now you got to realize that this is a multi-billion-dollar industry for Lipitor and Zocor and Pravachol and Crestor and Vitor and all these other statin drugs. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and they knew they had something when they were doing research on this. And they said, "Look, if we can find a drug that won't kill people." That lowers their cholesterol, we're going to be zillionaires. So they really had a lot of pressure to find out what was going on. Now the trouble is, when they would first test these drugs out, when in fact they test any drugs out, they develop them in the laboratory, and then they test them on laboratory animals, rats, rabbits, monkeys, mice, things like that. The trouble is that these rats, rabbits, monkeys, and mice eating normal rat chow, monkey chow, all the normal laboratory chow, don't have a high cholesterol. So how in the world are you going to test a drug that lowers cholesterol on animals that don't have a high cholesterol? Well, the answer is you have to induce it. You have to somehow figure out a way to give them a high cholesterol. And I imagine at first they would give them lots of eggs and butter. I got this cartoon picture in my head of them holding a rat in one hand and a fork full of eggs in the other and kind of stuffing eggs down and butter down this poor little rat's gullet. But they got really frustrated because all of the cholesterol they were feeding these animals failed to raise the blood cholesterol. And you got to realize, again, there's a multi-billion-dollar industry waiting. If they can't raise the cholesterol in these laboratory animals so they can test these statin drugs, then they're not going to make any money, and a lot of pressure. So how do they do it? How do they raise the cholesterol? Well, they found out that eggs and butter and other high cholesterol foods was not working, so they opened their minds up and they tried a bunch of different things. And when they finally found out what did raise cholesterol, they wrote it up in scientific papers. One of the initial ones was in the Journal of Laboratory and Animal Science. This is written up in December of 1995. This is actually work done by Merck Pharmaceutical, their lab division with DuPont. And the abstract there says that several investigators, not just them, have reported that feeding a semi-synthetic diet, not of eggs and butter and high-fat foods, but of casein, which is the protein found in skim milk, and dextrose, which is sugar, to New Zealand white rabbits will increase the total serum cholesterol concentration, principally through an increase in the beta-lipoprotein fraction, which carries the bad cholesterol, thereby creating a useful model for atherosclerosis research. They're telling all their laboratory buddies, don't worry about eggs and butter. That's not going to do it. You'll be frustrated. You got to feed them skim milk and sugar. You'll raise the cholesterol up. Then you can test the drugs on these laboratory animals, bring it down. You've proven the drugs are effective. Later in the same paper, they even said that one example of dietary manipulation is the use of a semi-purified cholesterol-free diet. No cholesterol in this diet at all was raising the cholesterol in these animals. A cholesterol-free diet of dextrose or sugar, casein from skim milk, to induce hyperlipidemia, high blood fats. The hypercholesterolemia or high blood cholesterol associated with a synthetic casein diet has been well characterized to the changes in circulating lipids and the kinetics of lipid metabolism. They knew very well that it was the skim milk and sugar that will raise the cholesterol, not eggs or butter. There were a lot of these studies. You can look it up. If you go to PubMed, search casein, C-A-S-E-I-N, and cholesterol, you'll see these same papers and more. Another one out of DuPont Merck in the Journal of Nutrition in December of 1996. Rats fed either isolated soy protein diet had lower cholesterol than those fed the casein diet from skim milk. From the journal Atherosclerosis, effects of, again, a cholesterol-free diet. No cholesterol in this diet raised the blood fats in these animals. Atherosclerosis in 1989. Cholesterol-free casein diet raised the total cholesterol in LDL in laboratory rabbits. A soy protein diet lowered them. From the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, says that the effects of soy isoflavones, and that was in 1998. The casein group had the most atherosclerosis. The soy group had the least. And then a human study, again from the same journal, American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. This is in the year 2002. They said that not only were the total cholesterol and LDL levels higher in the casein diet versus the soy diet, but a new finding, a novel finding, was that the plasma total homocysteine, which we're going to talk about later tonight, concentration higher in the groups who consumed casein than those who consumed soy protein. I'll tell you now that homocysteine is a very high risk factor for heart disease, stroke, dementias, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, osteoporosis, and a bunch more things. We'll tell you about homocysteine later, but suffice to say that the skim milk protein raised the homocysteine as well. So the pharmaceutical company's own research indicates that cholesterol-free diets of dextrose and casein raise the total cholesterol and LDL in rats, rabbits, monkeys, mice, and humans, but they don't tell you and they don't tell your doctor. And why do you think that is? Well, money for one. Back in the year 2000, Lipitor alone made $4 billion, $4,000 million that Lipitor made back then when it was just coming out in the year 2000. So now it's in extremely high numbers. There's well over $52 million a day generated by all these statin drugs. I think it's about $70 million a day. It's over, I think it's close to $40 billion now. So they have no interest in letting your doctors know where cholesterol comes from. And the sad thing, and scary to me, the sad thing is that most medical doctors believe that eggs cause high cholesterol. And that is a real problem, because if they think eggs cause high cholesterol, they don't understand cholesterol metabolism at all. And eggs and butter, as that example I showed you, do not have anything to do with blood cholesterol levels. And by the way, after the presentation tonight, we'll have a question and answer session, and then we'll have a drawing for the free programs for those of you who filled out the cards in the front. Now, if these statin drugs were just not needed and a waste of money, that'd be one thing. But the thing is, they do have some very harmful side effects. This is from Dr. Stephen Sinatra. He wrote a book on the CoQ10 phenomenon. He says the statin drugs used to lower cholesterol and triglycerides affect the liver, deplete CoQ10 from the body, which can lead to congestive heart failure and increased risk for breast cancer with statin drugs. Archives of Neurology. This is in the year 2004. Atorvastatin or Lipitor decreases the CoQ10 level in the blood of patients at risk for cardiovascular disease and stroke. Even brief exposure to atorvastatin or Lipitor or any of the other statin drugs causes a marked decrease in blood CoQ10 concentration. Widespread inhibition of CoQ10 synthesis could explain the most commonly reported adverse effects of statins, especially exercise intolerance, myalgia, which is muscle pain, and myoglobinuria. That's when you find myoglobin, or the muscle protein, in the urine. So what happens is these drugs, because the drugs are actually called HMG coenzyme A reductase inhibitors, that's what a statin drug is, that's the same enzyme, this HMG coenzyme A reductase, the same enzyme that creates cholesterol also creates CoQ10. You inhibit that enzyme, you lower cholesterol production, but you also lower the production of CoQ10, and that's very necessary for muscle function. A very important muscle in your chest cavity called your heart function can lead to congestive heart failure. Your brain needs CoQ10, your liver needs CoQ10, very important, and that's why you hear these side effects on the ads for the statin drugs. Your doctor is going to do tests for liver damage, and you're going to have if you have muscle pains, tell your doctor. Also, memory problems. We had a Dr. Gravlin, Dwayne Gravlin, on our show a couple years ago. We still have his show taped on the web at 1-800-CHEMIST.com. Dr. Gravlin wrote a book called Lipitor, Thief of Memory. He was an astronaut in Group 3 in the 60s. He never went up in space, but he was one of the groups behind the original Gemini astronauts. And he eventually developed high cholesterol. He would go back to NASA in Houston from his house in Florida every year to have a physical. And his doctor said, well, okay, your cholesterol's too high, now I'm going to put you on a statin drug called Lipitor. So he went on it. He's an MD. He listened to his medical doctor, and he went on Lipitor. And within about 3 or 4 days, his wife found him wandering in the garden outside. He didn't know who he was. He didn't know who she was. He had suffered transient global amnesia. Transient global amnesia. Transient global amnesia is losing your entire memory and ability to make new memory from time to time. And it was out, and he didn't know. They thought he might have had a stroke. They weren't sure exactly what happened to this man. They took him to a neurologist, said, no, you didn't suffer a stroke. They couldn't figure out what it was. Total memory loss. He said, well, look, the only thing new we did was add in the statin drug, and all the doctors and neurologists said, statins don't do that. It can't be that. Statins have never been shown to do that. Well, now we know they do. So he went off a statin anyway. Within about 2 weeks, his memory came back, and he knew that was what was causing a problem. A year later, he went back to Houston for his physical at NASA. The doctor said, look, your cholesterol is way too high. It wasn't the statin before. Go on the statin drug again. Went back on Lipitor. Within 3 or 4 days, his memory was shot again. His wife told him to go off of it, and he's been off of it ever since. He wrote the book Statin Drugs and something about that. His website is spacedoc.net, S-P-A-C-E space DOC, all one word, .net. Dr. Dwayne Gravlin, and he's got his books and his papers and everything up there. Now he thinks it may have given him ALS, Lou Gehrig's syndrome. Lots of data here. Now, so the bottom line is, if the doctor decides to prescribe a statin drug, they should be prescribing CoQ10 with it. Merck has 2 patents from years ago. They know very well that these drugs deplete CoQ10 and that by taking CoQ10 you really reverse the side effects, but they've never exercised those patents. They don't tell your doctor and they don't tell you that you should be taking CoQ10 if you think about taking statin drugs. And we've kind of demonstrated here in our clinic that most times people don't need the statins. If you do need it, you have to take CoQ10 with it. This is out of the American Journal of Cardiology, the effect of CoQ10 on muscle disease symptoms in people treated with statins. Double-blind study involving 32 patients, a fairly small study, with myopathic symptoms or muscle disease symptoms, muscle aches and pains associated with use of statins. Supplementation with CoQ10 found to significantly reduce pain severity and pain interference with daily life over the course of about 30 days. Another one from, this is the Toxicology and Applied Pharmacology in May of 2007. CoQ10 deficiency plays an important role in statin-induced liver disease, hepatopathy. CoQ10 supplementation protects the liver cells from this complication. And that's one of the best CoQ10s that we know, is one we use, is our product, Super Q Gel. You can get this in a health food store if you want to. It's just called Q Gel. We think this is as absorbable, if not more so, than the ubiquinol that everyone's talking about. Dr. Steven Sinatra actually developed this formula, the cardiologist, and with Tishcon Labs, and tested it out in his laboratory in his hospital, so he knew how much to give to raise the blood levels to a certain therapeutic level. Rather than reinvent the wheel, when we're going to private label some CoQ10, we've done his formula, and we've had it ever since. So you can get that one from us, or one just called Q Gel with a trademark at the health food store. It's 30 milligrams of this is equivalent to about 100 milligrams of the regular dry CoQ10. And if you're on a statin drug, we recommend 3 of these twice a day. If you have some symptoms, maybe 2 twice a day, but we've had very good success with that. We also know not only does dairy protein called casein raise the cholesterol and triglycerides, but we also know that refined sugar does. There's literature to support this. Cholesterol levels increase significantly when sucrose or refined sugar replaced glucose in test subjects. Archives of Biochemistry and Biophysics in 1964. Results of studies suggest that high sugar diets correlate with higher plasma triglyceride and cholesterol concentrations. Yudkin's work in Journal of Nutrition and Health in 1987, and Reiser wrote that a high sugar intake associated with increased total cholesterol and